preserved by their own blood, the Appalachian clan, the mummified family of the hills. Deep in the forgotten hollows of eastern Kentucky, where sunlight is swallowed by the mountains and silence reigns like an ancient king, a 1987 discovery shook the foundations of what we thought we knew about isolated American families. What hikers found in a crumbling farmhouse wasn't just death. It was a museum of genetic catastrophe, a family so intertwined by their own lineage that even in death their bodies refused to decay normally. This is the story of the Pritchard clan, a family that took the meaning of keeping bloodlines pure to an unimaginable extreme and paid the ultimate price, written in their very DNA. November 15, 1987. In Harlan County, Kentucky, the morning air carried the sharp bite of early winter, mixing with the perpetual fog that clung to the Appalachian ridges like a burial shroud. Two experienced hikers, Michael Patterson and his wife Sarah, had ventured off the marked trails of Pine Mountain, seeking the rumored remains of old homesteads that dotted these forgotten valleys. What they found would haunt them for the rest of their lives. From the tree line, the structure emerged like a corpse rising from a grave. A two-story farmhouse, its wooden planks bleached gray by decades of weather, leaned precariously to one side as if the earth itself was trying to swallow it whole. Like hollow eye sockets, broken windows stared out, and the front porch sagged in the middle, its boards rotted through by rain and time. Michael approached first, his boots crunching on frost-covered leaves, while Sarah hung back, camera in hand, documenting what they assumed would be just another abandoned relic of Appalachian history. Suspended by a single rusted hinge, the front door hung open. Michael pushed it wider and immediately recoiled. The smell that escaped wasn't the expected mustiness of abandonment, but something far more disturbing. A sweet chemical odor mixed with something organic and wrong. Sarah gagged, covering her nose with her jacket sleeve, against every instinct screaming at them to leave. Curiosity, and perhaps something darker, pulled them forward into the shadows of the Pritchard home. Frozen in the early 1950s, the interior was a time capsule. From the walls, faded floral wallpaper peeled in long strips. A kitchen table still held plates crusted with the remnants of a meal decades old. Across a threadbare sofa, newspapers from 1953 lay scattered. But it was what they found in the back bedroom that would etch this day into their nightmares forever. 7 bodies. Not skeletons, not the expected bones and dust of the long dead, but something between life and death that shouldn't exist. As if positioned for a family portrait. The corpses sat arranged around the room, their skin leather, like and dark, pulled tight over skulls and bones in a grotesque mockery of preservation. But it wasn't natural mummification. Their faces, frozen in expressions of terminal suffering, displayed features that immediately struck both hikers as profoundly wrong. In a rocking chair by the window, the largest figure, presumably the father, sat, his body tilted at an unnatural angle. Disproportionately small for his frame, his head featured a jaw that jutted forward in a severe underbite, and his eye sockets sat too far apart, giving his preserved face an almost inhuman appearance. Beside him, a woman, likely his wife, her body curved by severe spinal deformity, her hands twisted into claws by joints that had fused incorrectly. A horrifying catalog of genetic abnormalities was displayed by 3 children, if they could be called that, ranging from what appeared to be teenagers to young adults. One had a skull so misshapen, it looked as if it had been molded from clay by cruel hands. Another's limbs were different lengths, one arm significantly shorter than the other, the fingers webbed together, split by a cleft so severe it divided the upper jaw completely, was the third child's face. Teeth visible through the gap even in death. In a makeshift crib in the corner, 2 smaller forms, infants or toddlers, lay. The same terrible characteristics showed in their tiny bodies. Heads too large or too small, limbs bent at impossible angles, features that spoke of something fundamentally broken in their very creation. From her trembling hands, Sarah's camera fell. Backward, Michael stumbled, his mind struggling to process the scene. This wasn't just death. This was the physical manifestation of something taboo, something that violated the most basic laws of nature and human society. Around them, the room seemed to close in, the walls pressing inward, the air growing thicker with each breath. On the wall above the family, a single photograph hung in a cracked frame. It showed the same people, but alive, standing in front of this very house. In faded ink, the date scrawled on the back read June 1953. The Pritchard family together forever. The father had his arms around the mother and the oldest child. But as Michael's eyes adjusted to the dim light, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The resemblance between the father and mother wasn't just striking. It was impossible to ignore. They looked like siblings. Perhaps they were. Dozens of similar photographs were scattered throughout the room, documenting generations of the Pritchard family, and in each one the same unsettling truth revealed itself. With minimal variation, the faces repeated across generations. The same narrow jaw, the same wide, set eyes, the same distinctive nose appearing over and over as if the family had been photocopying itself for decades. A slightly more degraded copy of the last each generation. Through the overgrown yard and into the forest, Michael and Sarah fled the house, running until their lungs burned and their legs could carry them no further. When they finally reached their vehicle 3 miles away, Sarah immediately radioed for help while Michael sat in stunned silence, his mind replaying what they'd witnessed over and over like a horror film stuck on repeat. Within hours, on the location descended the Harlan County Sheriff's Department with a team of deputies, medical examiners, and eventually specialists from the University of Kentucky. What they found in that house would spark one of the most disturbing investigations in Kentucky's history. An investigation that would peel back layers of secrecy, shame, and genetic tragedy that had been hidden in these mountains for over a century. In clinical terms, the initial police report described the scene, but those first responders would later admit in private interviews that nothing in their training had prepared them for the Pritchard house. Carefully, the bodies were removed, photographed from every angle. As a crime scene, the entire structure was documented. Even though no crime in the legal sense had been committed, the real crime had been committed against nature itself, against the genetic diversity that keeps humanity strong and healthy. As news of the discovery spread through the local communities, a strange silence fell over the area. Suddenly, old-timers in the nearby town of Harlan had nothing to say. With tight lips and turned backs, questions about the Pritchard family were met. It was as if an unspoken agreement had existed for decades to never mention them, to let them disappear into the mountains and be forgotten. But now, with their mummified remains under examination in university laboratories, the secrets of the Pritchard clan could no longer be buried. Because what you're about to discover goes beyond anything you've heard before. Stories so disturbing and real that they'll change how you see the hidden corners of America forever. To examine the Pritchard remains, Dr. Eleanor Hayes, a forensic anthropologist from the University of Kentucky, was assigned. With 20 years of experience studying skeletal remains and ancient populations, she considered herself immune to shock. She was wrong. For the next 6 months, the examination room at the university's medical facility became her workspace, and what she discovered there would define her career and haunt her personal life forever. a unique form of preservation that Dr. Hayes had never encountered in her extensive career, had been undergone by the bodies. The combination of the house's specific microclimate, extremely low humidity in that particular hollow, mineral, rich water that had leaked through the roof for decades, and the body's own unusual biochemistry had created conditions that prevented normal decomposition. Instead, the corpses had slowly mummified, their tissues drying and hardening while maintaining much of their structural integrity. But it was what those preserved tissues revealed that truly shocked the scientific community. Challenging but ultimately successful proved DNA extraction from the mummified remains. The results, when they finally came back from the laboratory, caused Dr. Hayes to recheck the samples 3 times, certain there had been a mistake. There hadn't been a coefficient of inbreeding so extreme that it rivaled laboratory mice bred specifically for genetic research was revealed by the genetic analysis. Levels of homozygosity, where both copies of genes are identical, that shouldn't be possible in a natural human population, were shown by the 7 individuals. Through old county records, the father, identified as Jacob Pritchard, born in 1920, shared approximately 75% of his DNA with the mother, Mary Pritchard, born in 1922. This level of genetic similarity is only possible between parent and child, or between full siblings. Further analysis suggested they were both, a conclusion so disturbing that Dr. Hayes initially refused to include it in her preliminary report. An even darker story was told by the children's DNA. Increased homozygosity was shown by each successive generation, a genetic feedback loop where the already limited gene pool became more and more restricted. Virtually no genetic diversity was had by the oldest child, a male aged approximately 19 at death. Like it had been passed through a photocopier set to maximum contrast, his genome looked, eliminating all the subtle variations that make each human unique and healthy. Every physical abnormality was meticulously documented by Dr. Hayes, creating a catalog of genetic catastrophe that would become a textbook case study in the dangers of extreme consanguinity. Characteristics of mandibular prognathism, where the lower jaw protrudes significantly, were shown by the father's skull, a condition that becomes more pronounced with each generation of close relative breeding. Still visible in the mummified jaw, his teeth were crowded and misaligned, growing at angles that would have made eating difficult and painful. Severe scoliosis, a sideways curvature of the spine so pronounced that her rib cage had compressed her internal organs, was revealed by the mother's skeleton. In multiple locations, X-rays showed healed fractures, suggesting bones that broke easily due to mineral deficiencies caused by genetic metabolic disorders. Preserved in their twisted configuration, her hands showed signs of rheumatoid arthritis that had begun in her teenage years, another marker of autoimmune issues common in highly inbred populations. A horrifying spectrum of birth defects was presented by the children. The oldest had microcephaly, a condition where the brain and skull don't develop to normal size, combined with severe intellectual disability that would have left him functioning at the level of a toddler his entire life. A condition called limb length discrepancy was had by the second child, a female, where one leg was 4 inches shorter than the other, forcing her to walk with a severe limp. Signs of the same scoliosis that had plagued her mother, inherited and intensified by the narrowing gene pool, were shown by her spine, so severe that feeding would have been nearly impossible without surgical intervention. Was the third child's cleft palate, intervention that clearly never came in that isolated hollow. Signs of chronic infection, the kind that would have caused constant pain and likely contributed to malnutrition and eventual death, were shown by the preserved soft tissue around the opening. The final fatal stage of the Pritchard genetic collapse was represented by the two infants, no more than 3 years old at death. One had hydrocephalus, a buildup of fluid in the brain that had caused the skull to swell to nearly twice normal size. Signs of multiple organ failure, with an enlarged liver visible in the preserved remains, and kidneys that were malformed and undersized were shown by the other. Even with modern medical intervention, neither child would have survived long. But only part of the story, Dr. Hayes uncovered were the physical abnormalities. As she dug deeper into county records, old census data and church registries from the area, a pattern emerged that was both fascinating and revolting. By accident, the Pritchard family hadn't appeared in these mountains. They had been there for generations, and the consanguinity that destroyed the family in 1953 had roots stretching back to the 1800s. In 1876, the original Pritchard patriarch, Elias Pritchard, had arrived in Harlan County, bringing with him a wife and 5 children. From 1880, census records showed the family living in isolation, farming a remote valley accessible only by a narrow mountain path. By 1890, something had changed. The records became confusing with children listed whose parentage didn't make sense, ages that didn't align with previous census data, and family relationships that were deliberately obscured. From fragmentary records, what she could was pieced together by Dr. Hayes. In 1882, Elias's wife had died, leaving him with 4 sons and 1 daughter. Rather than remarrying or sending his daughter to live with relatives, Elias had kept the family isolated. By 1890, 3 children had been given birth to by his daughter Martha, but no father was listed. The ages suggested she had been 15 when the first child was born. With each generation, the pattern repeated. In their mountain hollow, the family remained isolated, occasionally appearing in town for supplies, but otherwise invisible to the outside world. Children were born, but their parentage was never officially recorded. The family grew, but the names remained the same. Pritchard children marrying Pritchard cousins, those children marrying each other, the gene pool shrinking generation by generation like a pond slowly evaporating under a merciless sun. By the time Jacob and Mary were born in the 1920s, they were the products of at least 4 generations of intensive inbreeding. Their parents had been siblings. Their grandparents had been first cousins. Their great-grandparents had been the children of Elias and his own daughter. For decades, the genetic damage had been accumulating, hidden in these isolated mountains, expressed in stillbirths, infant deaths, and children who survived but lived with profound disabilities. Now in his 80s, local historian Raymond Tucker remembered hearing stories about the Pritchards as a child. His own grandmother had warned him never to go near their hollow, calling them cursed by their own blood. When interviewed for Dr. Hayes's research, Raymond revealed that the isolation hadn't been entirely self-imposed. By the 1930s, the community had essentially shunned the Pritchard family, recognizing that something was deeply wrong, but lacking the language or understanding to name it. They'd come to town maybe twice a year. Raymond recalled, his weathered face troubled by the memories. Always looked sick, pale, thin, walking funny. The children, when they brought them, didn't look right. Didn't act right either. People would cross the street to avoid them. It was cruel, but folks were scared. Scared of what they represented. Scared it might be catching, though. Of course, it wasn't catching at all. It was in their blood from the beginning. At least 3 attempts had been made by local authorities to check on the family's welfare, discovered Dr. Hayes. In 1936, a county health officer had tried to visit but was turned away at gunpoint. In 1942, a truant officer investigating why no Pritchard children attended school made it to the house, but reported that the family claimed they were teaching at home and refused entry. The final attempt in 1949 by a social worker concerned about rumors of sick children ended when the social worker's car mysteriously broke down on the mountain road, and she never returned to investigate further. Deliberate had been the isolation, carefully maintained by a family that knew on some level that outsiders would interfere if they saw what was happening in that hollow. Apparently functional enough to maintain the barriers between his family and the world had been Jacob Pritchard. Despite his own genetic limitations, he farmed enough to keep them fed, hunted the abundant deer and wild turkey in the surrounding forests, and kept visitors away with a combination of geographic isolation and reputation. But maintaining that isolation came with a price that compounded with each generation. By the time the family died in 1953, they were so genetically compromised that even minor illnesses would have been potentially fatal. Evidence of tuberculosis in several family members was found by Dr. Hayes's analysis of preserved tissue samples, a disease that would have spread rapidly in the confined space of their farmhouse and been particularly devastating to immune systems weakened by genetic defects. Uncertain remained the cause of death for the family, but Dr. Hayes developed a theory based on the evidence. A severe winter storm had struck eastern Kentucky in January of 1953, dropping record snowfall and trapping communities for weeks. Likely found themselves cut off completely were the Pritchard family, already isolated and in poor health. With limited food stores, compromised immune systems, and active tuberculosis spreading through the family, they had probably died one by one over the course of several weeks, too weak to seek help and too isolated for help to reach them, even if they had wanted it. Based on the position of the bodies and evidence of desperate activity in the house, the final family member to die had been Jacob himself. He had apparently tried to arrange his family in some semblance of dignity, positioning them around the room as if they were simply resting. Then, with no one left and death approaching, he had taken his place in the rocking chair by the window, perhaps looking out at the mountains that had been both his family's kingdom and their prison, and waited for the end. As Dr. Hayes's research progressed, she realized that understanding the Pritchard family required more than genetic analysis and forensic examination. She needed to understand the social and cultural context that had allowed this situation to develop and persist for so long. She began conducting interviews with older residents of Harlan County, seeking anyone who remembered the Pritchards or knew their story. What she found was a community still grappling with guilt, shame, and the complicated legacy of a tragedy they had collectively chosen to ignore. When Dr. Hayes interviewed her in the spring of 1988, Martha Clemens was 92 years old. Her memory was sharp despite her age, and she had lived her entire life within 5 miles of the Pritchard Hollow. Martha remembered the family from her childhood in the 1930s, and her account provided crucial details about how the Pritchards were perceived by their neighbors. "My daddy forbade us from going anywhere near their place," Martha said, her gnarled hands wrapped around a cup of tea in her small living room. Said they were living in sin up there, that God had marked them for their wickedness. I didn't understand what he meant when I was young. I just knew there was a family in the mountains we weren't supposed to talk about. Well, see, once in town when Martha herself was about 12 years old, making it around 1938, Martha recalled seeing Mary Pritchard. She came into the general store where my mama was shopping. I'll never forget it. She was maybe 16, 17 years old, but she walked like an old woman, all hunched over. Her belly was swollen, clearly expecting a baby, but what I remember most was her face. She had this look empty, like nobody was home inside. And her teeth, Lord, her teeth were all crooked and brown. My mama grabbed my hand and pulled me outside before I could stare anymore. See. When Martha's mother had later explained in hushed tones that the Pritchard girl was carrying her brother's baby, young Martha hadn't fully understood. Back then we didn't talk about such things openly. But even as a child I knew it was wrong, deeply wrong. The way the adults talked about it, or rather didn't talk about it, told me it was something shameful beyond words. A different perspective was had by Thomas Riley, 87. His father had been a doctor who occasionally treated mountain families in the 1940s. Though he never visited the Pritchard home, he had apparently heard things through his medical network that troubled him deeply. My father came home one night, must have been 46 or 47, and I heard him talking to my mother in the kitchen. Thomas recalled. He said he'd heard from a midwife in the next county over about a family that kept having babies that weren't right, babies with terrible deformities, children who couldn't walk or talk properly. The midwife wanted to know what could be done, if there was any medical explanation. My father, he knew. He'd studied genetics in medical school, understood about bloodlines and heredity. He told my mother it was consanguinity, a word I didn't know then. He said there was a family up in the mountains that was breeding within itself, and the results were tragic. Says Thomas's father had wanted to intervene, but the legal and social frameworks of the time made it nearly impossible. What could he do? They weren't breaking any laws technically, couldn't force them to accept help, couldn't take the children away without proof of active harm. And the truth was, people didn't want to deal with it. Easier to pretend they didn't exist. Perhaps the most disturbing account came from Jenny Patterson, 79, whose uncle had been a local law enforcement officer in the early 1950s. He had been one of the last people to potentially interact with the Pritchard family before their deaths. 5. Uncle James told me this story years later, before he passed. Jenny said, it was late fall of '52. He thought maybe early winter. He'd gotten a report, he wouldn't say from who, that there were screams coming from the Pritchard place. Someone hiking near there had heard what sounded like a woman crying out in pain for hours. Uncle James, he was a good man, felt like he had to check on it. According to Jenny's account, her uncle had made the difficult trek to the Pritchard farmhouse on a gray November afternoon. He said the place looked like something from a nightmare, even from outside, filthy, falling apart. With this smell he could detect even in the open air. He knocked on the door and Jacob Pritchard answered. Uncle James said Jacob barely looked human. His face was all wrong, misshapen, and his eyes, they didn't focus right. Jacob told him everything was fine, that his wife was having another baby, but the midwife was there, and they didn't need help. But James had heard something that made him doubt Jacob's words. From inside the house came a sound he described as not quite human, a kind of mewling cry. That could have been a woman in extreme pain or something else entirely. Jacob had blocked the doorway, and behind him, James had glimpsed movement. Shapes that he said looked like people, but didn't move like people, shuffling in the darkness of the house. Uncle James said he should have pushed past Jacob. Should have insisted on checking on the family's welfare, but something stopped him. He said it was the smell and the sounds and the way Jacob stared at him with those wrong eyes. He was scared. A grown man, a law officer with a gun on his hip, and he was scared of what he might find in that house. So he left, and he regretted it until the day he died. From the shadows of guilt, Jenny's story emerged and struck the heart of the matter. The final baby born to the Pritchard family, if her uncle's timeline was correct, would have been born in late 1952, just months before the family's death. That baby was likely one of the 2 infant corpses found in the makeshift crib, a child born into suffering and granted only a brief, painful existence before death claimed the entire family. These testimonies were compiled by Dr. Hayes into a comprehensive oral history that accompanied her scientific findings. Together they painted a picture of a community that had failed to protect its most vulnerable members, not out of cruelty, but out of a combination of ignorance, fear, and the social taboos that prevented open discussion of such matters. The Pritchards had been allowed to suffer in isolation because confronting their situation would have required confronting uncomfortable truths about family, relationships, and the sometimes blurry line between privacy and neglect. Now think about the Pritchard children, born into a life they never chose, suffering from conditions they could never understand, isolated from a world that feared them and trapped in a hollow that was both home and prison. And if their story touches something deep inside you, if it makes you angry that this could happen, that people could suffer this way, then leave a comment with these words exactly. The mountains kept their secret too long. Let me see that comment so I know this story has reached someone who understands that some tragedies are not natural disasters, but human failures. By late 1988, a complete genetic profile of the Pritchard family had been assembled by Dr. Hayes, a document that would become one of the most cited case studies in human genetics. That fall, the findings were presented at a conference of forensic anthropologists in Chicago, and the audience of seasoned scientists sat in stunned silence as Dr. Hayes walked them through her discoveries. The presentation began with a family tree that looked more like a tangled vine than a branching structure. Using DNA evidence, historical records, and statistical analysis, Dr. Hayes had reconstructed 5 generations of the Pritchard family. The chart showed connections between family members marked with different colors: blue for parent, child relationships, green for siblings, red for reproductive partners. In a healthy family tree, these colors would rarely overlap. In the Pritchard tree, they formed a chaotic web of overlapping relationships that made it nearly impossible to define traditional family roles. At the top of the tree appeared Elias Pritchard, the patriarch who arrived in 1876. Below him the lines multiplied but never diverged. His daughter Martha had children, whose genetic fathers were clearly her brothers, producing offspring who were simultaneously cousins and half-siblings. Those children in turn had reproduced with each other, creating a second generation of compound relationships. By the time Jacob and Mary were born, they were connected by so many overlapping family lines that calculating their precise relationship required complex genetic analysis. The DNA data revealed that Jacob and Mary shared not just one recent common ancestor, but multiple common ancestors at every generation going back to Elias. They were related through their fathers, who were brothers. They were related through their mothers, who were sisters, and also daughters of those same brothers, and their mutual sister. Working backward through the generations created a mathematical nightmare where each person appeared multiple times in their own family tree. A visual representation of genetic diversity in normal populations versus the Pritchard family was presented by Dr. Hayes. In a healthy population, each person inherits roughly 50% of their DNA from each parent, and those parents share virtually no DNA except what's common to all humans. This creates genetic diversity that protects against hereditary diseases and promotes overall health. The chart showed this as a wide, colorful spectrum of genetic variation. The Pritchard chart, by contrast, was nearly monochrome. The genetic diversity that should have been present had collapsed to the point where family members were more genetically similar to each other than identical twins are in a normal population. Specific genes appeared in duplicate or triplicate copies, amplifying both normal variations and harmful mutations. Recessive genetic disorders that normally remain hidden, carried by one copy of a gene but never expressed, had been exposed in double copies throughout the Pritchard genome. One particular gene variant provided a stark example. Dr. Hayes identified a mutation in a gene responsible for collagen production, the protein that provides structure to bones, skin, and connective tissue. In a normal population, this mutation might appear in one copy in about 1 in 2,000 people, causing no symptoms because the normal copy of the gene compensates. In the Pritchard family, DNA analysis showed that virtually every member carried 2 copies of the mutated gene. The result was catastrophic. Weak bones that fractured easily, skin that tore and bruised with minimal trauma, joints that dislocated spontaneously, and teeth that grew improperly and fell out young. Amplified by generations of inbreeding, this single genetic variant could account for many of the physical problems documented in the mummified remains. But that was just one gene among thousands. At least 17 other genetic variants in the Pritchard DNA that existed in homozygous status, double, copy states and contributed to disease were identified by Dr. Hayes. Mutations affecting brain development, immune function, metabolism, sensory perception, and organ formation all appeared with frightening frequency. Not just 1 or 2 genetic problems, but a whole catalog of harmful mutations that accumulated and intensified over time had been inherited by each generation. Photographs of the mummified remains were included in the presentation, though Dr. Hayes warned the audience before displaying them. Even prepared professionals found the images difficult to view. The photographs documented each physical abnormality in clinical detail. The misshapen skulls, twisted spines, malformed limbs, all the visible manifestations of genetic catastrophe. But Dr. Hayes emphasized that the visible problems were likely only a fraction of the total damage. "We can see the skeletal abnormalities," she explained to her audience. "We can document the obvious physical deformities, but we cannot see the intellectual disabilities, the sensory problems, the chronic pain, the metabolic disorders, the immune deficiencies that these individuals almost certainly suffered from. The genetic evidence suggests they lived in constant physical discomfort, with bodies that were failing from birth, growing weaker and more compromised with each passing year." Said the Darters. Hayes then addressed the question that many had been wondering: how had this family survived as long as they did? The answer lay in a combination of geographic isolation, subsistence farming that required minimal physical capability, and the grim reality that many Pritchard children probably didn't survive to adulthood. Historical records suggested that for every child who grew to reproductive age, at least 2 or 3 had died in infancy or early childhood. Natural selection was operating here, Dr. Hayes noted. But in reverse, in a normal population, individuals with severe genetic problems die before reproducing, preventing those genes from spreading. In the Pritchard family, isolation meant that even individuals with serious genetic problems could reproduce, passing on their harmful mutations. But the mortality rate was extremely high. This family tree should have hundreds of members by the 1950s if every child had survived. Instead, we have evidence of only 7 individuals alive at the time of death. The conference presentation concluded with a discussion of the ethical implications. Could this tragedy have been prevented? Should the authorities have intervened earlier? What responsibility does society have to protect individuals in isolated communities from situations like this? The question sparked heated debate among the scientists and medical professionals present. Some argued that forced intervention would have violated the family's rights to privacy and autonomy. Others countered that the children born into this situation had rights to health care, education, and protection from preventable genetic harm. The discussion revealed deep divisions in how medical professionals and ethicists thought about consent, family rights, and the role of government in private matters. Dr. Hayes, for her part, remained focused on the scientific documentation. Her goal was to create a complete record of what happened to the Pritchard family so that their suffering might at least serve as a warning to others. She partnered with geneticists to publish detailed papers on the specific mutations found in the Pritchard DNA. She worked with medical illustrators to create anatomical drawings showing the progression of genetic damage across generations. She compiled the oral histories, the forensic evidence, and the DNA analysis into a comprehensive archive that was eventually donated to the National Library of Medicine. But beyond the science, Dr. Hayes found herself personally changed by the experience. In private moments, she admitted to colleagues that she couldn't stop thinking about the Pritchard children, about lives lived in pain and confusion, about potential that was destroyed before birth by the circumstances of their conception. She became an advocate for genetic counseling and education, particularly in isolated rural communities where the risks of consanguinity might not be well understood. The Pritchard case also sparked renewed interest in other cases of extreme inbreeding. Researchers began investigating similar situations in isolated communities around the world, from remote Pacific islands to mountain villages in Europe to desert settlements in the Middle East. What they found was that the Pritchard case, while extreme, was not unique. Wherever human populations became isolated and remained that way for multiple generations, the same patterns emerged, the same genetic collapse, the same tragic consequences. In 1989, the Pritchard farmhouse was demolished. The decision came after debate about whether it should be preserved as a historical site or destroyed to prevent morbid tourism. In the end, the family's remaining distant relatives, cousins who lived in other parts of Kentucky and had had no contact with the isolated branch for generations, requested that the structure be removed. They wanted no memorial to what they saw as a shameful chapter in their family's history. The demolition crew reported that the house seemed to resist destruction, as if the mountain itself wanted to keep it standing. Old timber, dried by decades and hardened by the unique preservation conditions, refused to break easily. For 3 days, the crew worked to reduce the structure to rubble. The debris was buried in a pit on site, covered with soil, and left to decompose naturally. No marker was placed. Slowly, the location returned to forest, reclaimed by the same wilderness that had enabled the Pritchard isolation in the first place. But if the physical structure was erased, the story itself proved impossible to bury. Throughout 1989 and 1990, Dr. Hayes's research was published in multiple scientific journals. In genetics courses, medical students studied the Pritchard case. The story was featured in documentaries, though often in sanitized versions that couldn't fully convey the horror of what had been found. In medical literature, the case became shorthand for the dangers of consanguinity, referenced in papers about genetic counseling, population genetics, and medical ethics. In Harlan County itself, the reaction was more complicated, as if the story painted their entire community in a negative light. Many residents felt exposed. They weren't wrong to feel defensive. The coverage often implied that this kind of situation was typical of Appalachian culture, which was both inaccurate and unfair. An extreme outlier was the Pritchard case, a confluence of isolation, poverty, and choices that spiraled out of control over generations. It wasn't representative of the region's people, who were mostly hardworking families trying to survive in difficult economic circumstances. But others in the community saw the story as an important cautionary tale, funded in part by grants seeking to prevent similar situations. Local health departments began offering genetic counseling services. Included in educational programs in schools was basic genetics instruction, teaching young people about heredity and the importance of genetic diversity, about family relationships and the boundaries that protect health and well-being. Churches held discussions. Martha Clemens, whose interview had provided crucial context for Dr. Hayes's research, lived to see much of this change. Before her death in 1993, she gave one final interview in which she reflected on the Pritchard story and what it meant for her community. "We failed them," she said simply. Not just our generation, but our parents and grandparents too. We knew something was wrong up in that hollow. We knew children were suffering. But we did nothing because it was easier to pretend we didn't know. We let our discomfort, our fear of getting involved, our worry about what people might think, we let all that stop us from doing what was right. Those children deserved better. They deserved someone to care enough to break the silence. Thus, Martha's words became something of a rallying cry for advocates working on issues of child welfare and medical neglect in isolated communities. The Pritchard case demonstrated that isolation itself could be a form of harm when it prevented vulnerable individuals from accessing help. It showed that community responsibility extended even to families that seemed to want no contact with the outside world. In unexpected ways, the scientific legacy of the Pritchard case continued to unfold. In 2003, researchers studying the Human Genome Project used DNA samples from the Pritchard remains as part of a larger study on genetic diseases. The extreme homozygosity of the Pritchard genome actually made it easier to identify which specific gene variants caused which symptoms, providing valuable data for understanding hereditary conditions that affect people worldwide. In 2012, a team of geneticists published a paper using the Pritchard family as a case study in their development of new algorithms for calculating inbreeding coefficients from DNA data. Their work improved the tools available for genetic counselors working with families at risk for hereditary diseases. In death, the Pritchard tragedy contributed to medical knowledge that would help prevent suffering for others. In 2015, Dr. Eleanor Hayes retired from the University of Kentucky after a distinguished career that included numerous other important discoveries. But in interviews during her retirement, she always returned to the Pritchard case as the most significant work of her life, not because it was scientifically complex, though it was, but because it was so profoundly human in its tragedy. "Every time I think about the Pritchard family," Dr. Hayes said in a 2018 interview, "I imagine those children trapped in bodies that were failing them, isolated from any help or understanding, living in a world that was both too small and too cruel. Science can explain what happened to them at the molecular level. Genetics can trace the path of harmful mutations through their family tree. But no amount of data can fully capture what it must have been like to live as they did. That's what haunts me still. Completely to nature has returned the hollow where the Pritchard house stood now. Though there's nothing left to mark it except a slight depression in the earth and stones that once formed a foundation. Hikers occasionally stumble across the site. Through what was once the farmyard, trees have grown. In the clearing, deer browse. The forest has reclaimed its own. But the story persists, passed down through academic papers and medical school lectures, through documentary programs and cautionary tales told in genetics classes. Unknowingly, the Pritchard family, who lived and died in isolation, became teachers to the world about the importance of genetic diversity, the dangers of prolonged isolation, and the human cost of shame and silence. In 2020, during the COVID pandemic, when many people found themselves isolated in ways they'd never experienced, the Pritchard case saw renewed interest. Articles comparing different types of isolation referenced the story. The Pritchard family was used by mental health professionals, discussing the importance of connection and community as an extreme example of what happens when isolation becomes absolute. In new ways, the story resonated, reminding people that human beings are fundamentally social creatures who need connection, diversity of thought and relationship, and community to thrive. Perhaps the final word belongs to the Pritchard family themselves, or rather to the genetic legacy they left behind. Those DNA samples, carefully preserved in university laboratories, continue to provide data for research into hereditary diseases, population genetics, and the effects of consanguinity. In a strange,